"Why is this vendor's compliance dated after their contract was signed?" I asked aloud, my voice flat and hollow in the empty room. I tapped the corner of my monitor, half expecting the digital ink to magically correct itself, or perhaps hoping to rub the sheer stupidity off the screen. It was 6:12 in the evening on a cold Thursday evening, and I was the only soul left in the compliance wing of our corporate headquarters. The overhead fluorescent lights, programmed to save energy, had already clicked off with a series of sharp metallic snaps, leaving only the dim glow of my dual monitors and the flickering red exit sign down the hall to illuminate my desk. The reflection of that red light danced in my cold cup of coffee, a dark pool of stagnant caffeine that matched my mood. The file open on my screen should have been boring. In my line of work, boring is a blessing. It should have screamed of dull checkboxes, routine rubber-stamped approvals, and standardized verification documents. Instead, it whispered of something far more sinister. I stared at the records for vendor hash 347, missing timestamps, temporarily waived security sections, absolutely zero backup documentation regarding their financial solvency, their data protection protocols, or their corporate registration. In fact, as I dug deeper, I realized this wasn't an isolated incident. Every single high-dollar vendor added to our database in the past 6 weeks shared the same anomalies. It was a digital shrug where due diligence was supposed to live. This wasn't a series of careless typos. It was a deliberate, systematic pattern. I was 48 years old, and I had spent 18 years navigating the shifting sands of corporate compliance. I had seen companies collapse under the weight of their own hubris, and I had watched flashy executives burn bright before being escorted from the building by federal agents. I knew the signs. I knew that a pattern like this didn't happen by accident. It required intent. It required someone with enough authority to bypass the guardrails, someone who viewed regulations not as laws, but as suggestions. Rather than sounding alarms or sending frantic emails, I took a breath. I survived 18 years in this industry by remaining clinical. I quietly opened a Slack thread with my direct manager, Julian Thorne. Julian was a decent man, but he was a career bureaucrat whose primary skill was staying out of the line of fire. I drafted a message, keeping the tone casual and non-threatening. I suggested that we initiate a soft internal review of the recently onboarded vendor files, framing it as a routine check to address potential integration glitches. A few minutes later, the 3 little dots appeared, followed by Julian's reply. "Let's not sound any false alarms, Nathaniel. I'm sure it's just growing pains with the new automated onboarding systems. You know how these transitions go. Let's keep this between us for now." I stared at the response. Julian's reaction was typical. He wanted to sweep it under the rug, hoping that whatever mess existed would miraculously clean itself. But my instincts, honed by nearly 2 decades of detecting corporate rot, told me otherwise. The same 4 mandatory compliance fields were blank or edited across all the questionable vendor packets. Each transaction involved a newly registered entity, often tracing back to a post office box in Delaware, or a shell company registered in Singapore. And every single one of these files bore the digital approval stamp of Preston Cole, our newly appointed Vice President of Operational Strategy. Preston had arrived 2 months prior, swept into the company like a human LinkedIn post. He was young, charismatic, and talked constantly about scale, velocity, and frictionless ecosystems. He had no patience for what he called legacy friction, which was his polite term for compliance. To Preston, compliance was a bottleneck, a department of old-school thinkers who existed solely to slow down his aggressive growth targets. I didn't hate him, but his initials sat on those altered documents like a curse. And I knew that his frictionless onboarding was creating a massive, ticking liability for the company. I decided to run the altered vendor files through our legacy compliance database. The executives hated the legacy system because the interface was old, green-screened, and required actual keyboard commands rather than sleek touchscreens. But it had one massive advantage. It was built on an immutable ledger system. Every edit, every timestamp bypass, every administrative override was logged in a database that could not be manipulated without leaving a clear trail. If someone backdated a form, the system recorded the true date of the entry. If a signature was bypassed, The system flagged the specific credentials used to perform the override. I sat back as the legacy system ran the comparison. Within 20 minutes, the results began to populate my screen, highlighted in a harsh amber text. The system didn't just suspect malfeasance, it practically laid out the corpse. Preston Cole's administrative credentials had been used to override security verifications on 15 separate occasions. Forms had been backdated by weeks to make them appear compliant before the contracts were executed. I opened a secure, encrypted folder on my local machine, naming it Vendor Anomalies. I began to quietly download the logs, the original unedited forms, the altered versions, and the system override logs. I didn't tag them with dramatic titles. I didn't use red fonts or exclamation points. I simply organized them chronologically, indexing them by vendor hash numbers. I also did something that younger analysts would find archaic. I printed hard copies. I had seen enough server wipes and sudden database corruptions during internal investigations to know that while digital recs can be deleted with a few keystrokes, paper is incredibly resilient. As the office printer quietly hummed in the dark corner, spitting out pages of evidence, I found the critical modification. Preston had personally edited the system's standard operating procedure controls. He had altered the system rules to allow his team to bypass the mandatory 7-day legal hold on vendor contracts. He had done this without the approval of the compliance committee or the legal department, hiding the change under a generic system update tag. The new rule allowed the vice president of operational strategy to waive due diligence during high-volume periods. I took the warm pages from the printer tray and slid them into a blank black binder. I was not afraid. I felt a familiar cold focus settling over me. The old compliance itch that had saved the firm from a catastrophic class action lawsuit in 2014 and a federal privacy violation in 2019 was back. It was a quiet voice, a warning whisper in the back of my mind. It told me that the storm was coming and that the man who had brought the lightning had no idea how to ground it. The following Monday, I experienced my first direct interaction with Preston Cole's operational strategy. He arrived at the weekly executive meeting 10 minutes late, carrying a premium insulated mug and radiating the kind of synthetic energy usually found in motivational seminars. He wore a tailored blazer over an expensive designer t-shirt, paired with pristine white sneakers that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. "Let's talk about growth velocity," Preston announced, bypassing the agenda entirely as he projected a slide deck filled with colorful graphs and minimal text. "Who is ready to break some old habits and scale this business?" I watched him from my seat at the far end of the long mahogany table. Preston was a master of the corporate vernacular. He spoke in rapid-fire buzzwords, ending his statements with questions like, "Does that resonate? Or are we aligned?" He described basic administrative shortcuts as frictionless scaling and referred to our legal vetting protocols as operational latency. Within 30 minutes, he had outlined a plan to reduce the vendor onboarding timeline from 2 weeks to under 48 hours. When he paused for questions, I raised my hand. Preston's eyes flicked to me, his smile remaining fixed but his eyes cooling. "Yes, Nathaniel, isn't it?" "Yes, Mr. Cole," I said, keeping my voice measured. I reviewed the proposed timeline. Reducing the onboarding window to 48 hours makes it impossible to complete the mandatory federal background checks and financial audits required under Section 302(b) of the regulatory framework. Bypassing these steps exposes us to severe liability. Preston laughed, a soft, patronizing sound that was designed to dismiss rather than debate. "Nathaniel, I appreciate the traditional perspective. Really, I do. But we are operating in a different landscape now. We need agility. If we spend weeks checking every single paper trail, our competitors will eat our lunch. We are building a risk-tolerant culture here. We manage risk through growth, not through red tape." Several department heads nodded in agreement. In a corporate environment, charm and the promise of high numbers are incredibly persuasive. The CEO, Alistair Vance, simply watched from the head of the table, his expression unreadable as he scrolled through his tablet. Over the next 2 weeks, my isolation began. It started subtly. I was omitted from the calendar invites for the weekly operational alignment meetings. Then, my access to the main project management boards was restricted to read-only status. Emails that had previously required my sign-off were routed directly to Preston's team, who utilized their newly created automated approval templates. I cornered Julian Thorne in the hallway near the break room one afternoon. He was stirring a cup of hot water, staring intently at the steam rising from the mug to avoid meeting my eyes. "Julian," I said quietly, "my team has been locked out of the vendor approval pipeline. The automatic system is letting contracts through without completed risk assessments." Julian sighed, finally looking up. "Nathaniel, Preston has the ear of the board. He's delivering numbers that we haven't seen in 3 years. The CEO wants results. If we push back too hard on process, we look like we're trying to block progress. Just let it go for a bit. Let them run their pilot." "Let them run their pilot," I replied. "Julian, if they onboard a vendor that fails a basic integrity check, the liability doesn't stop with Preston. It falls on the entire corporation. We could face a void ab initio ruling on every contract signed under these waived protocols." Julian shrugged, a weary, defeated gesture. "Just keep your head down, Nathaniel. Don't make this a personal crusade." I didn't argue. I knew that arguing with a man who had already surrendered his professional integrity was a waste of breath. I walked back to my desk, sat down, and opened my encrypted drive. I didn't feel anger. I felt the calm, steady rhythm of a professional who knew that when the building eventually caught fire, the people who had locked the emergency exits would be the first to look for someone to blame. I spent my evenings expanding Protocol Zero. I documented every single transaction that bypassed the standard vetting procedures. I tracked the digital signatures, the administrative overrides, and the specific dates when contracts were executed versus when the compliance checks were eventually marked as completed. I printed every document, placing them in 3-inch black binders with clear, alphabetical tabs. By the end of the 3rd week, I had 3 complete volumes of evidence. I knew that keeping them in the office was a risk. If Preston suspected I was compiling a file, he could easily arrange for my database access to be revoked and my local machine to be wiped under the guise of an IT security sweep. On a rainy Saturday morning, I packed the binders into a heavy, waterproof plastic bin. I drove to my sister's house in a quiet suburb 30 miles away. I didn't tell her what was in the bin. I simply asked if I could store it in her dry basement behind her holiday decorations. She looked at my tired eyes and the serious expression on my face. "Is everything okay at work, Nathaniel?" she asked. "Everything is fine," I replied, offering a reassuring smile. "I'm just taking out some insurance." Back at the office, the corporate culture was shifting rapidly. Preston's frictionless strategy was celebrated as a massive success. The company had onboarded 40 new vendors in less than a month, and the operational dashboards were all displaying bright green indicators. Preston was the man of the hour, frequently seen walking through the executive suite, sharing jokes with Alistair Vance and receiving pats on the back from the board members. I sat in my quiet corner, invisible, ignored, but completely aware. I watched the numbers climb, and I watched the structural integrity of our compliance framework slowly erode. I knew that a system built on waived rules and forged timestamps was like a house built on sand. It looked beautiful from the outside, but it could not withstand the first real tremor. The quarterly board meeting was held in Conference Room A on the top floor of the building. The room was designed to impress, featuring double-height windows that overlooked the city skyline, plush leather chairs, and a massive mahogany table that had been polished to a mirror-like shine. I sat at the far end of the room, near the door, holding a single black binder. I was scheduled to give a 2-minute compliance update at the very end of the meeting, after the financial reports, the marketing presentations, and Preston's operational summary. Preston went first. He was in his element, pacing the front of the room, using a laser pointer to highlight the massive spike in vendor acquisition. He spoke of synergy, operational efficiency, and the elimination of bureaucratic latency. The board members were captivated, smiling and nodding as he presented slide after slide of positive metrics. When he finished, the room erupted into applause. Alistair Vance, the CEO, smiled and nodded. "Great work, Preston. Truly outstanding results." Then, the board chair glanced at the agenda. "All right, I believe we have a quick update from compliance. Nathaniel, the floor is yours." I stood up, walked to the podium, and projected my first slide. I kept my presentation simple and devoid of emotional language. I presented 3 slides illustrating the gap between contract execution and compliance certification. We have observed a significant trend over the past 6 weeks. I began, keeping my voice steady. Out of the 40 new vendors onboarded under the new fast-track protocol, 15 currently lack completed background verifications. Furthermore, administrative overrides were used to bypass the mandatory legal holds on these contracts, creating potential compliance vulnerabilities. Before I could transition to the next slide, a loud, theatrical laugh cut through the room. It was Preston. He leaned back in his leather chair, shaking his head with an amused grin. "Oh, Nathaniel," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "you're still beating this drum. I thought we had moved past the era of filing reports in color-coded folders." Several board members chuckled. Preston stood up, walking to the center of the room, effectively reclaiming the spotlight. "Look, everyone," Preston said, addressing the board with an easy, confident wave of his hand. Nathaniel is a dedicated analyst, but he's viewing the world through a keyhole. He's concerned about missing signatures on files that are 99% complete. We are running a multi-million-dollar operation here. We cannot halt our growth velocity because compliance wants to spend 3 weeks verifying a phone number for a vendor that has been vetted by our operations team. He turned to me, offering a mocking wink. "No offense, Nathaniel. We appreciate your diligence, but we need to operate at the speed of business." I looked at the board members. None of them were looking at my slides. They were looking at Preston, smiling at his charm. I looked at Alistair Vance. The CEO was staring at his phone, completely disinterested. The message was clear. They had chosen the illusion of speed over the reality of law. I calmly closed my laptop, picked up my binder, and walked back to my seat. My face didn't betray my thoughts, but beneath my professional exterior, a cold, quiet anger had solidified. I knew that my attempts to warn them from within were officially over. They didn't want to be saved. The next morning, I sat at my desk and opened my mail client. I drafted a formal memorandum. I addressed it directly to Preston Cole, and I BCC'd Clara Harper, the company's internal legal counsel. I outlined the specific compliance violations, focusing on vendor hash 347. I cited California Penal Code Section 470 regarding the alteration of digital records and explained that contracts executed without valid compliance verifications were subject to being declared void ab initio. I formally recommended an immediate halt to the fast-track onboarding process and a comprehensive audit of all vendors onboarded under the new protocol. I clicked send at precisely 6:08 in the morning. 27 minutes later, Preston's reply arrived. It was short, typed from his mobile device, and devoid of punctuation or professional greeting. "Thanks for the bedtime story. Appreciate the passion. Keep focusing on your files." I printed the email thread, including the server log metadata that proved he had opened my attachment, and added it to the binder. I had given him a clear, documented warning. He had dismissed it with documented sarcasm. The trap was set, and Preston had walked right into it, leaving a perfect trail of electronic evidence. The silence that followed that exchange was heavy. For 3 weeks, nothing changed. Preston continued to boast about his metrics, and I continued to document the quiet erosion of our regulatory standing. I knew that the federal regulators would eventually notice the inconsistencies in our reports. When you operate in a highly regulated industry, you don't get away with shortcuts forever. The system is designed to catch the outliers, and our fast-track data was a massive red flag. The storm broke on a Tuesday morning. I was analyzing a standard report when I heard a sudden, tense, hushed silence descend on the executive wing. People stopped talking. The usual low hum of phone conversations and keyboard clicks evaporated, replaced by a strained, nervous quiet. A few minutes later, Julian Thorne walked into my office. His face was pale, his eyes wide and anxious. He closed the door behind him and leaned against it, breathing heavily. "They're here," he whispered. "Who is here, Julian?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "The Federal Office of Vendor Integrity," Julian said, his voice shaking. "They sent an official courier with an administrative request. They are conducting a spot-check audit of our third-party vendor onboarding records. Specifically, they want to review the compliance files for vendor hash 341 through vendor hash 350, 10 vendors. The exact 10 vendors that I had documented in my binders. The exact 10 vendors that Preston had bypassed. They've requested a meeting in the main boardroom at 10 in the morning on Thursday. Julian continued, wringing his hands. Preston is frantic. He's trying to get his team to pull the files. But Nathaniel, some of those files are missing key verifications. I sat back, my expression calm. I'm sure Preston's automated system can aggregate the documents quickly. Julian, after all, he promised the board that the process was frictionless. Julian looked at me, a desperate, pleading look in his eyes. Nathaniel, please. If those files aren't compliant, the company could face massive fines. Alistair is furious. He wants to know why we weren't prepared for this. I stood up and picked up my notebook. I will attend the briefing on Thursday, Julian. I'll make sure we have whatever support materials are available. For the next 48 hours, the third floor was a war zone. Preston's team worked through the night, attempting to reconstruct compliance histories that didn't exist. I saw them running back and forth, their faces grim, their voices raised in hushed, panicked arguments. I caught a glimpse of Preston through the glass wall of his office. The confident, charismatic VP was gone. In his place was a desperate man, his tie loosened, his hair disheveled, shouting into his phone while staring at a spreadsheet filled with red cells. On Wednesday afternoon, I passed Clara Harper, our internal legal counsel, in the hallway. She stopped me, her expression serious. "Nathaniel," she said, her voice quiet. "Did your department receive any formal warnings about the vendor files before this audit request arrived?" I looked at her, maintaining a neutral expression. "I suggest you check your archives, Clara. I sent a comprehensive analysis on the subject a few weeks ago." She stared at me for a moment, her eyes narrowing as she processed my words. She nodded once, a slow, understanding gesture, and walked away without another word. She was a good lawyer. She knew exactly what that meant. Thursday morning arrived, cold and foggy. The boardroom was packed with the executive leadership team. The air was thick with tension, the silence absolute. No one spoke. No one checked their phones. No one adjusted their papers. The large video screen at the end of the room flickered to life. A Zoom connection was established, revealing a woman sitting in a stark, professional office with a federal seal visible behind her chair. Her gray hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and her steel-rimmed glasses sat low on her nose. Her name was Vivian Finch, Senior Compliance Investigator for the Federal Office of Vendor Integrity. "Thank you for meeting with me on short notice," Ms. Finch began, her voice calm and completely devoid of warmth. "We are reviewing the third-party vendor integrations for your firm. Let's start with vendor hash 347. Can you provide the compliance certification that was verified prior to the execution of their contract?" Preston Cole cleared his throat, leaning forward and attempting to project his signature confidence, though his voice was a pitch higher than usual. "Of course, Investigator Finch," he said, flashing a tight smile. "Vendor hash 347 was part of our operational acceleration pilot. Due to the high volume of transactions, some administrative elements were finalized post-engagement. However, they were managed within our internal risk flexibility parameters." Miss Finch did not blink. She did not look at the spreadsheet Preston projected. She simply stared through the camera. "Mr. Cole," she said, her voice cutting through his explanation like a scalpel. "My question was specific. Do you have a valid compliance certification on file for this vendor that is dated prior to the contract signature date?" Preston stared at the screen. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He swiped his finger across his tablet, staring at a document that I knew contained no signature. The silence in the room was deafening. You could hear the faint rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. We are currently consolidating those records," Preston stammered, the sweat visible on his forehead. "The new system is automated, and there may be a lag in the document retrieval process." "I see," Ms. Finch replied, her voice dropping a register. "A lag in document retrieval, or a failure to perform mandatory federal due diligence." Alistair Vance, the CEO, turned slowly in his chair. His face was a mask of cold, controlled fury. He looked at Preston. Then he turned his eyes toward the far end of the table, where I sat. "Nathaniel," Alistair said, his voice low and dangerous. Do you have the documentation for vendor hash 347? I didn't hesitate. I opened my briefcase, pulled out the thick black binder, and placed it on the polished mahogany table. The sound of the binder hitting the wood was loud in the quiet room. I slid it down the table toward the CEO. Podge 14, sir, I said calmly. Alistair opened the binder. He looked at the documents. He saw the contract signature date, which was dated weeks before the compliance checks were even attempted. He saw the override log, showing Preston's credentials being used to bypass the security check. And he saw the printed email thread, starting with my formal warning about the risk of forgery under California Penal Code, Section 470, and the threat of contracts being void ab initio, followed by Preston's reply, "Thanks for the bedtime story." Alistair stared at the page for what felt like an eternity. He did not look at Preston. He did not look at the board members. He simply closed the binder, looked at the camera, and addressed the regulator mess. "Finch, I will personally ensure that a complete, unedited documentation packet is delivered to your office by the end of the day, courtesy of our senior analyst, Nathaniel Frost. We will cooperate fully with your review." "Thank you, Mr. Vance," Vivian Finch replied, her expression unchanged. "We will await the packet." The connection severed and the screen went black. Alistair Vance turned to Preston. Preston was pale, shaking, looking around the room for support that did not exist. Julian Thorne looked down at his hands. The board members sat in silence, completely detached from the man they had applauded just 2 days prior. "Clean out your office, Preston," Alistair said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "You're fired." "I wait, Alistair." Preston started, his voice cracking. "This was an operational decision to drive growth, the metrics." "You are terminated for cause," Alistair interrupted, not raising his voice. "Security will escort you from the building." A security guard who had been waiting outside the door stepped into the room. Preston looked around one last time, realizing that his charm, his buzzwords, and his flashy metrics were completely useless against the simple, undeniable reality of a paper trail. He stood up slowly and walked out of the room, his head bowed, the door clicking shut behind him. 3 days later, I stood in the elevator with Alistair Vance. It was early morning and the building was quiet. We stood side by side watching the floor numbers light up. As the elevator reached the executive floor, Alistair spoke, his voice quiet. "Thank you, Nathaniel." "You're welcome, sir," I replied. That afternoon, I received a notification from HR. My title had been updated to Director of Compliance and Risk Management, effective immediately. My new office sat on the corner of the executive floor, featuring a large window that overlooked the city. I didn't celebrate. I didn't update my social media profile. I simply moved my things into the new space, box by box, binder by binder. Once I had unpacked the last file, I hung a single frame on the wall behind my desk. Inside it was a printout of the email I had sent to Preston, with his reply preserved at the top. It was a reminder to anyone who entered my office that in the corporate world, short-term speed is a poor substitute for long-term integrity. The voice you ignore today might just be the one that writes your exit ticket tomorrow. And in the end, the rules always win.